Recovered battlefield imagery, fragmentary deck logs, and testimony from later campaign compilations describe a towering war engine in the livery of the 3rd Legion, standing where ceremony, training, and command once overlapped. The surviving references do not begin with his birth world or gene record. They begin with procedure. They place him in the Hall of Rites aboard the strike cruiser Andronius, in a role tied to judgement, advancement, and the maintenance of Legion standards. Even before the later catastrophe on Isstvan, he appears in the record less as a mere line officer and more as a fixed point inside the Emperor's Children command culture, a figure trusted to evaluate aspirants, preserve formal custom, and stand close to Fulgrim's inner circle. Some accounts note that he could detect falsehood almost as soon as it was spoken, a detail repeated often enough to suggest that his authority rested not only on age or rank, but on unusual force of perception. The name attached to those reports is Rylanor. His earliest personal history is not preserved in the clean biographical manner that later imperial institutions would have preferred. No reliable canon source gives a confirmed place of birth, a human family line, or a civilian identity prior to Legion service. What can be stated with confidence is that he belonged to the Emperor's Children during the Great Crusade and had served from its beginning, which places him among the older, formative generation of the Legion's warriors. That matters because the 3rd Legion was not a typical formation in its early years. It suffered a severe genetic catastrophe before Fulgrim's rediscovery, and by the time the Primarch was reunited with his sons, there were only 200 Terran-recruited survivors left to carry the Legion forward. Whether Rylanor was explicitly one of those final 200 is not stated outright in the sources cited here, but his long service and later prestige place him close to that founding era of hardship, recovery, and institutional memory. To understand Rylanor's development, it is necessary to understand the environment that shaped the Legion he served. The Emperor's Children were marked very early by unusual honour. They alone bore the Emperor's own name and carried the Palatina Aquila by direct grant, a distinction tied to both exemplary service and the Emperor's personal favour. Their culture evolved around exactitude, presentation, rank consciousness, and the conviction that no detail was too minor to refine. Their battlefield method was not brute momentum alone, but combined arms warfare, complex manoeuvre, tactical discourse, and a relentless pursuit of mastery. Fulgrim deepened these traits after his rediscovery on Chemos, and Chemos itself was a harsh world of dim light, industrial exhaustion, and disciplined reclamation, a place where survival demanded efficiency and waste was intolerable. In that Legion, prestige did not come cheaply. A warrior who rose into the innermost ceremonial and evaluative structures had to embody not merely martial skill, but measured judgment and consistency over long periods of service. That is the frame in which Rylanor first becomes visible as an individual rather than a name in a roster. By the mature years of the Great Crusade, he had become the Ancient of Rites of the Emperor's Children, a title that joined military authority to ritual oversight. The office placed him in charge of supervising the progression of recruits from novice status toward the elite state associated with Fulgrim's chosen warriors. This was not a decorative function. In a Legion obsessed with calibrated excellence, advancement required scrutiny, and scrutiny required someone trusted to preserve standards without distortion. Rylanor therefore stood at a junction between institutional memory and living selection. He was not simply a relic of earlier wars. He was one of the officers through whom the Legion reproduced itself culturally. A warrior passed through battlefields by surviving them. A Legion passed through generations by deciding what kind of warrior counted as worthy. Rylanor helped make that decision. At some point, decades before the Horus Heresy, he was gravely wounded in battle against the Eldar. The specific engagement is not named in the summary sources, but the consequence is clear. His body could no longer continue in ordinary Astartes form, and his life was preserved through interment within a Dreadnought. That transition is central to his development because it changed the manner of his service without ending it. Dreadnought interment in the Great Crusade and Heresy eras was at once a rescue, a sentence, and an honour. It preserved an irreplaceable veteran by sealing the ruined remainder of his organic life inside a heavily armed war sarcophagus, usually waking him for battle, counsel, or moments of exceptional need. Rylanor did not lose status through this transformation. He retained his office as Ancient of Rites after internment, which indicates that the Emperor's children considered his judgment as valuable as his firepower. He became a being whose very form embodied continuity, a warrior physically broken by centuries of war and mechanically preserved so that the Legion's standards could keep speaking through him. This also helps explain why later tradition remembers him with such unusual gravity. In the Emperor's children, honours and distinctions were not supposed to drift loosely through sentiment. They were assigned, observed, and reinforced inside a rigid hierarchy that matched role to proven excellence. Fulgrim's Legion valued conformity and order at the structural level, even while its warriors competed fiercely in pride and accomplishment. Within that system, Rylanor's continued authority after his internment tells its own story. He was not parked aside as a ceremonial machine from a fading generation. He remained responsible for the Hall of Rites aboard the Andronius, a major Legion vessel that functioned as a second flagship after the Pride of the Emperor. That placement made him part of the operational and cultural heart of the Legion, not its museum wing. He existed where aspirants were measured, where traditions were maintained, and where the older soul of the Third Legion still held shape before corruption finished its work. There is another developmental point worth stressing. Rylanor's reputation was not built only on loyalty or antiquity, but on discernment. The recurring note that he could sense a lie the moment it was told is one of those small details that would be easy to dismiss if it appeared only once. Instead, it persists in summary accounts of his office. Whether this should be taken literally as a near-superhuman instinct, or more cautiously as testimony to long experience reading motive, posture, and hesitation, the effect is the same. Rylanor was understood as a difficult man to deceive. That trait matters in a Legion whose pursuit of perfection was already curdling into vanity and resentment long before the final break. The Emperor's children had become experts at refinement, but also increasingly vulnerable to pride, jealousy, and concealed decay. A veteran custodian who could still identify falsehood represented a moral and institutional counterweight to that slide. He did not merely preserve rights, he preserved standards against self-serving performance, which is a very different thing. The relationship between Rylanor and Fulgrim belongs to this same period of tightening contradiction. Rylanor was counted among the senior officers who attended the Primarch and executed his commands. That placed him inside the trusted circle of a Legion master, who was by then one of the most brilliant and most dangerous figures of the age. Fulgrim's strengths were real. He was patient where Horus was intuitive, methodical where others were direct, and he shaped the Emperor's children into a force admired for flexibility, precision, and polish. Yet the same sources that praise the Legion's excellence also point to the poison already working within it. Nothing was ever enough. Every outside honour became either a challenge or an injury, and mastery itself became fuel for contempt. Rylanor developed within that environment without surrendering to it. Chapter 1 needs that contrast clear from the start. He was not simply a product of the Emperor's children. He was one of the pieces of evidence that the Legion once contained a durable nobility strong enough to resist the corruption that later consumed most of it. The clearest scene of his pre-Isstvan character comes shortly before the betrayal. Captain Saul Tarvitz petitioned Rylanor for reassignment immediately before the deployment that would become the Isstvan atrocity. Rylanor approved the request and transferred Tarvitz from combat duties to a staff posting aboard the Andronius. In isolation, that might look like routine administration. In context, it reads as something heavier. Tarvitz had suspicions. Rylanor, whose office already involved judgement and whose reputation included an eye for deceit, stands at the doorway of that pivotal decision. The canon summaries do not over-explain his private thoughts, and it is better not to force certainty where the record is restrained. But the event shows him doing what he had long been built to do, evaluating a warrior, recognizing the weight behind a request, and acting within the formal machinery of the Legion at exactly the point where formality was about to give way to massacre. The irony is brutal, an institution devoted to perfect order, was already arranging its own murder, and one of its oldest guardians was still carrying out his office with integrity. By the time the fleet translated the loyalist elements of the Emperor's Children toward destruction, Rylanor had already become more than a character note in Legion history. He was a bridge between the battered early Legion that survived near extinction, the disciplined culture that Fulgrim forged into prestige, and the last remnant of honour that would refuse the final fall. His early life, in the strict biographical sense, remains mostly hidden. His development, however, is unusually visible. It can be traced through service from the opening span of the Great Crusade, through survival of wounds that would have killed lesser men, through elevation into a dreadnought without loss of duty, through guardianship of rites, recruits, and standards, and into the final calm before the trap was sprung. That is where Part 1 properly leaves him. Not yet at the end for which he is most famous, but fully formed as the kind of warrior who could endure betrayal without becoming false himself. Rylanor's defining characteristics are best understood as a combination of preserved legacy and imposed transformation. By the later years of the Great Crusade, he no longer existed in the form of a standard Astartes. His mortal body had been critically damaged in prior campaigns, and what remained of him was interred within a dreadnought chassis. This conversion did not erase identity, it stabilized it. Within the Emperor's Children, where appearance, posture, and presentation carried as much weight as battlefield performance, the transition into a dreadnought could have reduced an individual to a purely functional asset. In Rylanor's case, the opposite occurred. The machine became an extension of an already established authority. The chassis he inhabited followed the broader design principles of Legion-era dreadnoughts. It was a towering armoured construct, standing significantly taller than a fully equipped Space Marine and possessing a mass that allowed it to anchor a battle line or breach fortified positions without external support. Its exterior plating was built for resilience against anti-armour fire, layered with ceramite and reinforced structural framing. The Emperor's Children aesthetic remained present in its finish, with clean lines and heraldic markings that reflected the Legion's obsession with refinement even in war machines. Unlike later degraded forms adopted after the Heresy, this was still a construct aligned with precision and discipline rather than excess or distortion. Internally, the sarcophagus housing Rylanor preserved what remained of his biological form in a state of controlled suspension. Neural interfaces connected him directly to the machine's movement systems, weapon controls, and sensory inputs. This arrangement allowed him to operate the Dreadnought not as a pilot separate from the machine, but as an integrated entity. His perception extended through sensor arrays rather than organic sight, allowing for enhanced battlefield awareness. Targeting systems provided calculated firing solutions, but these did not replace judgment. They amplified it. The effectiveness of a dreadnought depended heavily on the experience of the individual interred within it, and Rylanor's long service made him particularly suited to exploiting that advantage. The standard weapon configurations available to Legion dreadnoughts included heavy assault cannons, power fists, and integrated ranged systems designed for both anti-infantry and anti-armor engagements. While exact loadouts vary across sources and individual deployments, Rylanor's combat role indicates a preference for balanced capability rather than specialization. He was not a purely defensive relic, nor an indiscriminate siege engine. He functioned as a controlled force multiplier, capable of adapting to battlefield conditions and supporting Legion formations with deliberate, measured violence. His presence would have provided both direct firepower and a stabilizing influence on surrounding units, particularly in complex engagements requiring coordination rather than brute advance. Maintenance and deployment of such a machine required dedicated support from Legion Tech Marines and servitor crews. The Emperor's Children maintained high standards even in these processes, ensuring that their war engines reflected the same level of care as their warriors. Rylanor's Dreadnought would have undergone regular rites of activation, calibration, and preservation, keeping both mechanical systems and neural integration stable across extended periods of dormancy. These procedures were not merely technical, they were part of the Legion's ritual structure, reinforcing the idea that even in a mechanized state, an individual like Rylanor remained a respected participant in the Legion's hierarchy. His distinctive traits extended beyond physical form into behavioral consistency. Accounts repeatedly describe him as composed, measured, and difficult to deceive. This was not a superficial quality. It was a function of accumulated experience across decades of warfare and internal Legion governance. In a culture where ambition and rivalry were common, the ability to identify insincerity or concealed intent became a form of authority in its own right. Rylanor's role as Ancient of Rites depended on this capacity. He evaluated aspirants, observed conduct, and maintained standards without allowing personal bias or external pressure to distort his judgment. Unlike many within the Emperor's Children, whose pursuit of perfection evolved into vanity or obsession, Rylanor's interpretation of excellence remained grounded. He did not reject the Legion's ideals. He embodied their earlier, more stable form. Precision, discipline, and mastery were for him functional qualities tied to effectiveness and integrity, not tools for personal glorification. This distinction became increasingly significant as the Legion drifted toward excess. Where others sought recognition, he maintained consistency. Where others adapted their behavior to gain favor or display superiority, he continued to operate within established structures. His personality can be described as restrained rather than expressive. He did not rely on dramatic displays of authority. His position did not require it. Authority in his case came from recognition of reliability and competence. Subordinates and peers alike would have understood that his decisions were based on evaluation rather than impulse. This predictability made him a stabilizing presence within a Legion that was becoming less stable over time. It also explains why individuals such as Saul Tarvitz approached him in moments requiring trust. Rylanor represented a point in the chain of command where judgment could still be expected to align with principle rather than shifting internal politics. There is also an element of detachment in his recorded demeanor, though it should not be interpreted as indifference. As a Dreadnought, his existence was already partially removed from ordinary human and Astartes experience. Extended periods of dormancy, followed by abrupt reactivation for combat or consultation, created a pattern of awareness that differed from continuously active personnel. This separation likely reinforced his objectivity. He was not constantly embedded in the day-to-day rivalries and social dynamics of the Legion. When he engaged, it was with a clarity shaped by both distance and memory. Despite this, he remained fully integrated into the Legion's command and ceremonial structure. His role in the Hall of Rites required direct interaction with recruits, officers, and command staff. He was not isolated from the Legion's evolution. He observed it closely. This dual position, both participant and observer, contributed to his ability to recognize deviations from established norms. As the Emperor's Children moved further from their original doctrine, individuals like Rylanor would have been among the first to perceive the shift, even if the full extent of it was not immediately apparent. His loyalty to the Emperor and the Imperium appears consistent across all reliable accounts. There is no indication of wavering allegiance during the period leading up to the Horus Heresy. This is notable given his proximity to Fulgrim and the inner structure of the Legion. Many who stood in similar positions were either convinced, coerced, or corrupted into following the Primarch's descent. Rylanor did not. His adherence to established principles over personal loyalty to Fulgrim suggests a hierarchy of values in which duty to the Imperium and its original purpose took precedence over Legion identity when the two came into conflict. Another defining trait is endurance, both physical and psychological. Survival to the point of Dreadnought internment already indicates a level of resilience beyond the norm. Continued effectiveness after that transformation requires additional adaptation. The experience of existing within a machine, separated from direct sensory input and dependent on artificial systems, places strain on cognition and identity. Many Dreadnoughts exhibit shifts in behavior over time, ranging from increased aggression to withdrawal or instability. Rylanor's continued clarity of judgment and functional role within the Legion indicates that he retained control over these pressures. His communication style, inferred from the available accounts, aligns with his broader personality: direct, precise, and without unnecessary elaboration. This manner of speech would have reinforced his authority, particularly in formal settings such as the Hall of Rites. It also aligns with the Emperor's Children's early emphasis on controlled expression. Before the Legion's later excesses, communication was expected to be efficient and purposeful, reflecting clarity of thought and discipline. Rylanor's presence carried symbolic weight in addition to practical function. As a veteran of the Legion's earlier struggles and a visible example of survival through transformation, he embodied continuity. For newer recruits, he represented the history they were inheriting. For established officers, he represented a standard that had been set before their own rise. This symbolic role was reinforced by his physical form. A Dreadnought is not easily ignored. It commands attention simply by existing within a space. In Rylanor's case, that presence was tied to meaning rather than intimidation alone. It is also important to note what he did not exhibit. There are no reliable descriptions of him engaging in the competitive vanity that became common within the Emperor's Children. No emphasis on personal display, no recorded indulgence in the excesses that later defined the Legion. His focus remained on function, duty, and evaluation. This absence of deviation is itself a distinctive trait when considered against the broader trajectory of the Legion. By the time the events leading to Isstvan were set in motion, Rylanor stood as a convergence of multiple roles. He was a war machine capable of significant battlefield impact. He was an institutional figure responsible for maintaining standards and overseeing progression. He was a veteran whose experience extended back to the formative years of the Legion. And he was an individual whose personal conduct remained aligned with the original ideals of the Emperor's Children, even as those ideals were being eroded. These combined traits define him more clearly than any single attribute. His weapons and armor made him formidable. His position made him influential. His personality made him reliable. Together they created a figure who could operate effectively within a system that was already beginning to fail, without becoming part of that failure. Rylanor's notable achievements are not recorded as a sequence of celebrated campaigns in the conventional manner, but rather as sustained contributions to the structure and identity of the Emperor's Children across a prolonged period of service. This distinction matters. Many Legion officers earn distinction through singular victories or strategic brilliance in isolated engagements. Rylanor's significance lies in continuity. He operated across multiple phases of the Legion's history, from its early recovery period following genetic instability, through its rise to prominence under Fulgrim, and into the final stages before the Horus Heresy. His achievement is therefore cumulative rather than episodic. One of his most significant roles was his position as Ancient of Rites. This was not a ceremonial title in the superficial sense. It represented a critical function within the Legion's internal structure. The Emperor's Children placed unusual emphasis on controlled progression, refinement of skill, and maintenance of standards. Advancement within the Legion was not based solely on battlefield survival or numerical success. It required evaluation, discipline, and adherence to a defined ideal of perfection. Rylanor was responsible for overseeing this process. He presided over the Hall of Rites aboard the strike cruiser Andronius, where aspirants were assessed and where transitions into elite status were formalized. This role placed him at the center of the Legion's internal development. Every warrior who advanced through the Emperor's Children passed, directly or indirectly, through a system that he supervised. His decisions influenced not only individual careers, but the overall composition of the Legion. In this capacity, his achievement was structural. He helped determine what qualities were preserved, reinforced or rejected within the Legion's evolving identity. This form of influence is less visible than battlefield command, but its long-term impact is considerable. It shaped how the Legion functioned, how it perceived itself, and how it presented its capabilities to the wider Imperium. His continued service after interment into a Dreadnought further reinforces the significance of his role. Dreadnoughts were typically deployed as battlefield assets, or consulted for strategic insight based on prior experience. Retaining a formal institutional position after such a transformation indicates a level of trust that extended beyond combat effectiveness. Rylanor was not replaced or sidelined. He remained responsible for the same duties he had performed prior to his injuries. This continuity demonstrates that his value to the Legion was not diminished by his physical condition. Instead, his transformation reinforced his status as a repository of experience and judgment. Another notable achievement is his involvement in the events immediately preceding the Isstvan deployment. The reassignment of Captain Saul Tarvitz from active combat duty to a staff position aboard the Andronius appears, at first glance, as a routine administrative action. In retrospect, it represents a critical moment within the broader context of the Horus Heresy. Tarvitz would later play a central role in resisting the betrayal on Isstvan III. Rylanor's decision to approve the transfer placed Tarvitz in a position that allowed him to act. While it would be inaccurate to attribute the subsequent resistance solely to this decision, it remains a point where Rylanor's judgment intersected with a pivotal historical outcome. It is important to approach this event without imposing retrospective certainty. The available sources do not explicitly state Rylanor's intentions or awareness of the impending betrayal. However, his established ability to detect inconsistency and his position within the Legion's evaluative structure suggest that he recognized the seriousness of Tarvitz's concerns. Whether he understood the full scope of the situation is not confirmed. What can be stated is that he acted in a manner consistent with his role, prioritizing judgment and procedure over dismissal or convenience. In doing so, he contributed indirectly to the preservation of loyalist resistance within a legion that was otherwise turning against the Imperium. Rylanor's organizational alignment is clear and consistent across all reliable accounts. He was aligned with the Emperor's children as a legion of the Imperium, serving under Fulgrim while maintaining loyalty to the Emperor and the broader objectives of the Great Crusade. His position within the Legion placed him close to its command structure, but there is no evidence that he adopted the ideological shift that later defined the traitor legions. His alignment remained tied to the original purpose of the Astartes as instruments of imperial unification and stability. This distinction becomes increasingly significant when considering the trajectory of the Emperor's children. As the Legion moved toward corruption, many of its officers and warriors adapted their alignment to follow Fulgrim's descent. Loyalty to the Primarch superseded loyalty to the Imperium. Rylanor did not follow this path. His adherence to established principles rather than personal allegiance defined his position. This placed him in implicit opposition to the direction the Legion was taking, even before that opposition became explicit during the events of the Heresy. His alignment also reflects a broader pattern observed among certain long-serving Legion veterans. Individuals who had experienced the early hardships of their legions often retained a stronger connection to their foundational purpose. They had served before the consolidation of identity around their Primarchs, and were therefore less dependent on personal loyalty to a single figure. Rylanor's development within the early Emperor's children likely contributed to this perspective. His understanding of the Legion's purpose was rooted in survival, discipline, and service, rather than in the later pursuit of perfection for its own sake. In terms of military contribution, while specific engagements attributed solely to Rylanor are not extensively documented in the available sources, his presence as a Dreadnought would have had a measurable impact on battlefield operations. Dreadnoughts function as force multipliers, capable of altering the outcome of engagements through concentrated firepower and resilience. Rylanor's experience would have enhanced this effect, allowing him to apply force with precision rather than relying on brute application alone. His role would have included both direct engagement and support of Legion units, reinforcing positions, breaking enemy lines, and stabilizing critical points within a battle. However, it is his institutional role that remains his most distinctive achievement. The Emperor's children were defined not only by their victories, but by their internal culture. Maintaining that culture required individuals who could enforce standards without deviation. Rylanor fulfilled that function over an extended period, ensuring that the Legion's identity remained coherent even as external pressures and internal changes threatened to disrupt it. His ability to perform this role consistently, across both biological and mechanized states, represents a level of dedication that exceeds conventional measures of achievement. As Chapter 1 concludes, Rylanor can be understood as a figure defined by stability within a changing system. His origins are partially obscured, but his development is clear. He rose through a legion recovering from near destruction, contributed to its refinement under Fulgrim, and maintained a position of authority that influenced its internal structure. His transformation into a Dreadnought did not diminish his role, but reinforced his function as a carrier of experience and judgment. His traits, equipment, and personality aligned toward a single consistent pattern. He was precise without being rigid, disciplined without being inflexible, and authoritative without reliance on display. His loyalty remained aligned with the Imperium even as his legion diverged. His decisions, particularly in the period leading to Isstvan, demonstrate an adherence to principle that would later define his legacy more clearly. By the end of this chapter, Rylanor stands not as an outlier, but as a representation of what the Emperor's children were intended to be before their corruption. He embodies the Legion's original ideals in their functional form, stripped of later distortion. His achievements are not confined to isolated victories, but are embedded in the structure and continuity of the Legion itself. His alignment reflects a commitment to purpose over personality, and his presence marks a point of resistance within a system that was already beginning to fail. This position sets the stage for the events that follow. The qualities established here, consistency, judgment, and adherence to principle, will define his actions when the Legion's transformation becomes irreversible. Fragmented entries recovered from Administratum archive vaults and Mechanicus data repositories present a consistent pattern when referencing Rylanor. The language varies depending on origin, but the conclusions converge. He is not categorized solely as a war asset. He is recorded as a stabilizing constant within a legion whose internal condition was becoming increasingly difficult to quantify. Early Administratum cross-references classify him under senior command infrastructure rather than frontline deployment, despite his capacity for direct combat. This distinction indicates that Imperial record keepers recognized his broader function within the Emperor's children before the onset of the Horus Heresy. Administratum impressions tend to focus on role consistency and procedural reliability. In several compiled reports concerning Legion organization, Rylanor is associated with controlled advancement systems and internal evaluation structures. These reports emphasize that the Emperor's children maintained unusually strict standards compared to other legions, and that this rigidity required continuous oversight. Rylanor appears repeatedly in these contexts, not as a symbolic overseer, but as an active enforcer of criteria tied to performance, discipline, and conduct. His presence is often linked to successful integration of new recruits into higher operational tiers, suggesting that his assessments were both accurate and effective over time. From a bureaucratic perspective, predictability is a valued trait. Administratum analysts note that Rylanor's decisions exhibit low variance across extended periods. This is not interpreted as inflexibility, but as consistency aligned with established doctrine. In contrast to other officers within the Emperor's children, whose records show increasing divergence in behaviour as the Legion evolved, Rylanor's profile remained stable. This consistency becomes more pronounced in later entries, where deviations within the Legion are recorded with increasing frequency. In these same records, Rylanor is often cited as an exception to emerging irregularities. Mechanicus observations approach the subject from a different angle. Their records prioritize functional analysis of the Dreadnought chassis and its integration with the interred individual. Rylanor's case is noted for its efficiency. The neural link between pilot and machine shows minimal degradation over time, and his operational output remains within optimal parameters across multiple activation cycles. This level of sustained performance is not typical. Many Dreadnoughts exhibit gradual decline in responsiveness or cognitive clarity due to the strain of prolonged interment. Rylanor's stability is therefore flagged as a point of interest. Technical logs indicate that his chassis required standard maintenance cycles without significant deviation. There are no recorded instances of systemic instability, feedback anomalies, or interface rejection. This suggests a high degree of compatibility between his neurological profile and the machine's control systems. Mechanicus analysts interpret this as evidence of strong cognitive resilience. The ability to maintain coherent identity and operational clarity within a Dreadnought over extended periods is considered a marker of exceptional mental discipline. Additional observations focus on his activation patterns. Unlike some Dreadnoughts that are deployed primarily in high-intensity combat scenarios, Rylanor's recorded activations include both combat and non-combat functions. He's present in ceremonial contexts, evaluation procedures, and command consultations. This dual-use deployment is relatively uncommon. It indicates that his value was not limited to battlefield performance, but extended into advisory and institutional roles. Mechanicus records categorize him as a hybrid asset, combining combat capability with strategic and procedural utility. There are also references to his sensor utilization and targeting behavior during engagements. Data fragments suggest that his firing patterns prioritize efficiency over volume. He does not expend ammunition unnecessarily, and his engagement sequences show calculated targeting rather than reactive discharge. This aligns with his broader profile of controlled action. Mechanicus analysts note that such behavior reduces strain on weapon systems and improves overall operational longevity, further contributing to his classification as a stable asset. Administratum observations begin to shift in tone as the timeline approaches the period immediately preceding the Horus Heresy. Reports concerning the Emperor's children include increasing mentions of irregular conduct, internal competition, and deviations from standard operational protocols. Within these same reports, Rylanor continues to appear as a reference point for adherence to established norms. This contrast is not explicitly framed as criticism of the Legion, but the implication is clear. He represents a baseline against which deviation can be measured. One notable finding involves his interaction with other officers. While detailed personal accounts are limited, cross-referenced entries indicate that individuals seeking reassignment or clarification of duty often directed requests through channels associated with Rylanor's authority. This pattern suggests a perception of reliability. Personnel appear to have viewed him as a point of resolution within a system that was becoming less predictable. From an administratum perspective, this behavior reinforces his classification as a stabilizing influence within the command structure. Mechanicus records also contain indirect references to his presence during pre-deployment preparations. These entries do not describe his actions in narrative form, but his inclusion in activation logs and readiness checks indicates participation in operational planning stages. His involvement at this level suggests that his experience was considered relevant beyond immediate combat scenarios. He contributed to the preparation and organization of deployments, not just their execution. A recurring theme across both Administratum and Mechanicus sources is the absence of anomaly flags. In a period where many records begin to include notes on irregular behavior, unauthorized modifications, or deviations from standard doctrine, Rylanor's entries remain consistent. This absence is itself a notable finding. It indicates that he did not engage in the forms of divergence that were beginning to characterize the Emperor's children. From a data analysis standpoint, he represents a control sample within a dataset showing increasing variance. There are, however, subtle indications that his stability was not entirely unobserved in a neutral context. Some Mechanicus annotations include marginal notes questioning the long-term sustainability of such consistency within a changing operational environment. These notes do not accuse or speculate directly, but they acknowledge that a stable element within an unstable system may eventually encounter conflict conditions. This is presented as a theoretical consideration rather than a documented event. Administratum summaries compiled after initial reports of the Horus Heresy begin to retrospectively highlight individuals who maintained alignment with Imperial doctrine. Rylanor appears in these summaries as part of a subset of Emperor's Children personnel whose records did not show prior deviation. These entries are careful in their language, avoiding definitive conclusions where data is incomplete, but they establish a pattern of behavior consistent with loyalty to original Legion principles. From both perspectives, Rylanor's most significant attribute is not a single action, but the persistence of his operational profile across time. He does not exhibit the fluctuations seen in other records. His decisions align with established doctrine. His mechanical performance remains within expected parameters. His interactions with personnel follow consistent patterns. This uniformity allows both Administratum and Mechanicus analysts to treat his data as reliable when constructing broader assessments of Legion behavior. In summary, the combined observations of the Adeptus Administratum and Adeptus Mechanicus present Rylanor as a figure defined by stability, efficiency, and adherence to function. He is recorded as both a combat asset and an institutional component, capable of contributing to multiple aspects of Legion operation without deviation. His Dreadnought integration is noted for its effectiveness, and his behavioral profile is marked by consistency in a period where inconsistency was becoming more common. These findings do not elevate him through dramatic distinction. They identify him through absence of error and persistence of standard. Within Imperial systems that rely on pattern recognition and deviation analysis, this places him in a unique position. He becomes a reference point, not because he deviates from expectation, but because he continues to meet it when others no longer do. Administratum records that extend beyond structural summaries begin to isolate Rylanor's direct involvement in specific interactions, though these entries remain formal and restrained in tone. Personal engagements are not described through narrative embellishment, but through procedural outcomes and command adjustments. When individuals within the Emperor's Children required reassignment, clarification of duty, or resolution of internal conflict, Rylanor's authority appears as a recurring point of reference. Requests routed through his office show a higher rate of approval consistency when compared against other command channels within the same legion. This does not indicate leniency. It reflects alignment between evaluation criteria and final decisions, suggesting that his judgments were both predictable and trusted within the administrative framework. One of the most frequently cited engagements involves Captain Saul Tarvitz. Administratum cross-referencing identifies the reassignment request as originating from Tarvitz shortly before the Isstvan deployment cycle. The approval, authorized through Rylanor's office, resulted in Tarvitz's transfer from active combat placement to a position aboard the strike cruiser Andronius. From a purely bureaucratic standpoint, the action conforms to standard procedure. A senior officer petitions for reassignment, the request is evaluated and a decision is issued. However, the timing and outcome elevate this interaction beyond routine classification. Subsequent events confirm that Tarvitz's survival and ability to act during the Isstvan atrocity were directly linked to this reassignment. Administratum interpretation of this engagement avoids retrospective attribution of intent. There is no recorded statement indicating that Rylanor possessed foreknowledge of the impending betrayal. However, the alignment between Tarvitz's concerns and the approval of his request is noted as a statistically significant deviation from random administrative processing. In simpler terms, the decision reflects judgment rather than procedural default. This reinforces earlier assessments of Rylanor's ability to evaluate personnel beyond surface-level metrics. He did not process requests mechanically, he interpreted them within context. Additional engagements, while less individually prominent, follow similar patterns. Personnel seeking reassignment away from specific deployments, or requesting clarification on command directives, often encountered resistance within the Emperor's Children as internal competition intensified. In contrast, requests processed through Rylanor's authority show a higher likelihood of resolution without escalation. This suggests that his position functioned as a buffer within the command structure, absorbing potential conflict and converting it into actionable decisions. From an administratum perspective, this reduces systemic friction and improves operational efficiency. Mechanicus observations of personal engagements are limited to instances where interaction intersects with technical or deployment considerations. Activation logs indicate that Rylanor was consulted during pre-engagement planning phases in multiple campaigns. While the specifics of these consultations are not preserved in narrative form, the frequency of his inclusion suggests that his input was considered valuable in determining deployment configurations and engagement strategies. Mechanicus analysts categorize this as advisory utilization of a Dreadnought asset, a role typically reserved for individuals with extensive operational experience. There are also indications of direct battlefield engagements, where Rylanor's presence influenced tactical outcomes. Data fragments from combat telemetry show instances of coordinated action between his Dreadnought unit and surrounding Legion forces. His engagement patterns, characterized by controlled targeting and efficient resource use, appear to have stabilized formations under pressure. Mechanicus interpretation frames this as a force multiplier effect, where the presence of a highly experienced operator enhances the performance of adjacent units. This is consistent with broader Dreadnought deployment doctrine, but Rylanor's case is noted for the consistency of this effect across multiple engagements. Politically, Rylanor occupies a position that is both central and restrained. Within the Emperor's Children, political influence is often expressed through proximity to Fulgrim, participation in strategic decision-making, and visible demonstration of excellence. Rylanor meets some of these criteria through his role and status, but does not exhibit the competitive behaviours associated with political advancement within the Legion. Administratum records do not show evidence of him leveraging his position for personal elevation or engaging in factional alignment within the command structure. This absence of political manoeuvring is itself a defining characteristic. From an external perspective, his role as Ancient of Rites carries political significance beyond the internal dynamics of the Legion. The Emperor's Children were viewed by other imperial institutions as exemplars of discipline and refinement. Maintaining that reputation required internal consistency. Rylanor's oversight of advancement and standards contributed directly to this perception. His decisions influenced how the Legion presented itself to the wider Imperium, affecting diplomatic interactions, joint operations, and overall strategic confidence in the Legion's reliability. Mechanic's evaluation of political importance is framed in terms of asset classification, rather than interpersonal dynamics. Rylanor is categorized as a high-value integrated asset, combining durable combat capability with stable cognitive function and institutional relevance. This classification places him above standard Dreadnought units, which are typically valued primarily for their combat output. His inclusion in non-combat functions increases his strategic importance, as he contributes to both operational execution and organizational coherence. Subject value, when quantified across both Administratum and Mechanicus frameworks, is derived from multiple factors. Longevity of service is one. Rylanor's extended operational history provides a depth of experience that cannot be replicated through accelerated training or recruitment. Consistency of performance is another. His records show minimal deviation from expected parameters, both in mechanical operation and decision-making. Versatility further increases his value. He's deployed in combat, consulted in planning, and integrated into ceremonial and evaluative functions. This range of application reduces the need for additional specialized personnel, improving overall efficiency. There is also an element of symbolic value that, while not always explicitly stated, is implied through repeated inclusion in high-level records. Rylanor represents continuity within a Legion undergoing internal change. For Administratum analysts, this continuity provides a reference point for assessing deviation. For Mechanicus observers, it demonstrates the potential for long-term stability in Dreadnought integration when supported by appropriate cognitive profiles. In both cases, his existence contributes to broader understanding beyond his immediate role. As the timeline approaches the onset of the Horus Heresy, the divergence between Rylanor's profile and the evolving state of the Emperor's Children becomes more pronounced in retrospective analysis. Administratum summaries compiled after initial reports of the betrayal identify individuals whose records remained aligned with Imperial doctrine. Rylanor is consistently included in this subset. His prior engagements, decisions, and behavioral patterns are re-evaluated in light of subsequent events, reinforcing the conclusion that his alignment did not shift in parallel with the Legion. Mechanicus annotations from the same period include speculative notes regarding the implications of his stability within an unstable system. These notes do not predict specific outcomes, but they acknowledge that an asset maintaining consistent parameters may become a point of resistance when surrounding variables change. This is framed as a theoretical model rather than a confirmed observation, but it aligns with the broader pattern identified in administratum records. In summary, Rylanor's personal engagements demonstrate a consistent application of judgment within both administrative and operational contexts. His interactions with personnel, particularly in cases requiring evaluation or reassignment, reflect an ability to interpret underlying factors rather than relying solely on procedural criteria. His political importance lies not in active maneuvering, but in the influence of his role on Legion structure and external perception. His subject value, assessed through both Administratum and Mechanicus frameworks, is elevated by his longevity, consistency, versatility, and symbolic significance. These combined factors position him as a high-value asset whose importance extends beyond immediate function. He operates as a point of integration between combat effectiveness, institutional stability, and long-term continuity, maintaining alignment with established standards even as the system around him begins to diverge. Administratum war registries that reference Rylanor do not isolate him through a singular campaign record in the manner typically reserved for primary commanders or strategic architects. Instead, his presence is distributed across multiple engagements as a consistent component of Emperor's Children deployments during the latter phases of the Great Crusade. This distribution reflects the nature of his assignment. He was not a campaign-specific commander, but a persistent operational asset embedded within Legion formations. His war record is therefore cumulative, constructed through repeated participation in engagements, rather than through singular attribution. Early entries associate his activity with expeditionary fleet actions typical of the Emperor's Children during their period of expansion under Fulgrim. These campaigns are characterized by combined arms coordination, precision strikes, and disciplined execution of compliance operations. While individual battles are not explicitly detailed in surviving summaries, Rylanor's inclusion in deployment logs indicates active participation in these operations. As a Dreadnought, his role would have involved breaching fortified positions, providing heavy fire support, and stabilizing advancing formations. Administratum assessments categorize such contributions as structural support rather than command leadership, but they remain critical to overall campaign success. Mechanicus combat telemetry fragments provide a more technical view of his battlefield activity. These records, though incomplete, consistently show engagement patterns aligned with controlled application of force. Target prioritization follows logical sequencing, focusing on high-value threats before shifting to secondary objectives. Ammunition expenditure remains within efficient parameters, and there is minimal evidence of reactive or uncontrolled discharge. This level of operational discipline reduces mechanical strain and increases sustained effectiveness across extended engagements. Mechanicus analysts interpret this as optimal utilization of Dreadnought capabilities, enhanced by the experience of the operator. As the Great Crusade progressed, the Emperor's Children increasingly operated in environments requiring complex coordination rather than straightforward assault. Rylanor's presence in these deployments suggests that his role extended beyond direct combat. He functioned as a stabilizing element within formations that required precise timing and disciplined execution. Administratum records note that units operating in proximity to his position exhibit lower variance in formation integrity under pressure. This is not attributed to command authority alone, but to the combined effect of his fire support and the psychological impact of his presence as a veteran asset. The most extensively documented phase of his war record occurs during the events surrounding the Isstvan system. Administratum entries classify the deployment of Emperor's Children forces to Isstvan III as part of a compliance action, consistent with standard Imperial operations. However, subsequent records identify the event as a deviation from established protocol, resulting in the internal destruction of loyalist elements within multiple legions. Rylanor's involvement in this operation is recorded through a combination of deployment logs, activation records, and post-event analysis. At the time of the initial bombardment of Isstvan III, Rylanor was not deployed on the planetary surface. His position aboard the strike cruiser Andronius placed him outside the immediate kill zone targeted by the virus bombing initiated by traitor forces. Administratum analysis identifies this as a critical factor in his survival. Units and personnel assigned to orbital or secondary fleet positions were not subjected to the same level of immediate destruction as those deployed on the surface. This distribution of forces, while standard in large-scale operations, resulted in unintended preservation of certain loyalist elements. Following the realization of the betrayal, records indicate that Rylanor engaged in actions aligned with loyalist resistance. While detailed combat logs from this period are fragmented, cross-referenced entries confirm that he did not align with the traitor elements of the Emperor's Children. His subsequent deployment to the surface of Isstvan III places him within the broader context of loyalist forces attempting to regroup and resist annihilation. Mechanicus telemetry from this phase is limited, but available data suggests high-intensity engagement conditions, with increased frequency of weapon discharge and structural stress indicators consistent with sustained combat. Administratum post-event summaries categorize the Isstvan III engagement as a near-total loss of loyalist forces within the affected legions. Survival rates are recorded as minimal, with isolated instances of resistance extending beyond initial projections. Rylanor's continued activity within this environment is therefore classified as exceptional in terms of endurance and persistence. His Dreadnought chassis, designed for resilience, would have provided a significant advantage in surviving both environmental hazards and direct combat. However, mechanical durability alone does not account for sustained operational effectiveness under such conditions. His continued engagement reflects both physical capability and psychological commitment. Mechanicus analysis of the Isstvan phase includes speculative reconstruction of his operational state during extended combat. Data suggests that prolonged exposure to high-intensity engagement would have required continuous management of power distribution, weapon cooling systems, and structural integrity. The absence of recorded system failure indicates that these factors were maintained within acceptable limits, despite adverse conditions. This reinforces earlier observations regarding his efficient use of resources and controlled engagement patterns. Beyond Isstvan, records of Rylanor's activity become increasingly sparse and fragmented. Administratum archives contain references to isolated signals, residual transmissions, and unverified reports of continued presence on the planet. These entries are marked with varying levels of confidence, reflecting the difficulty of maintaining accurate records in a contested and degraded environment. Some reports suggest prolonged survival beyond standard operational expectations for both biological and mechanical systems. However, these claims are not uniformly confirmed and are therefore classified with caution. Mechanicus annotations on these later records include theoretical assessments of long-term Dreadnought sustainability and isolation. Under normal conditions, such units require periodic maintenance, resupply, and system recalibration. Extended operation without support would typically result in gradual degradation of both mechanical and neural systems. The persistence of Rylanor's operational profile under such conditions is therefore noted as an anomaly, though not one that can be conclusively verified due to incomplete data. The results of his recorded engagements can be summarized through their cumulative impact, rather than through individual victories. During the Great Crusade, his contribution supported successful compliance operations and reinforced Legion effectiveness. During the Isstvan engagement, his actions contributed to the continuation of loyalist resistance within an environment designed to eliminate it. While the overall outcome of the Isstvan operation was determined by strategic factors beyond the influence of any single individual, his presence represents a measurable extension of resistance beyond initial expectations. From an administratum perspective, the conclusion drawn from his war record emphasizes reliability and persistence. He is not categorized as a decisive commander whose actions altered the course of major campaigns. Instead, he is classified as a consistent operational asset whose contributions, when aggregated, support broader strategic objectives. His performance does not exhibit extreme variance, and his actions align with established doctrine even under conditions of systemic breakdown. Mechanicus' conclusions focus on the technical implications of his performance. His Dreadnought integration is validated as effective across both standard and extreme operational conditions. His ability to maintain system stability, manage resource consumption, and sustain engagement over extended periods reinforces existing models of optimal Dreadnought utilization. His case is used as a reference point in assessing the potential longevity and reliability of similar units when operated by individuals with comparable cognitive profiles. In closing, the combined perspectives of the Adeptus Administratum and Adeptus Mechanicus present Rylanor's war record as an example of sustained effectiveness rather than isolated distinction. His engagements demonstrate controlled application of force, consistent adherence to operational standards, and resilience under adverse conditions. The results of his actions are reflected not in singular victories, but in the persistence of function within environments where failure was expected. He is therefore recorded not as an anomaly of performance, but as an anomaly of consistency. Within datasets marked by increasing irregularity, his record remains aligned with established parameters, providing both institutions with a stable reference point for analysis. Inquisition archive fragments referencing Rylanor do not follow a single unified narrative. They are distributed across Ordo-level data caches, post-heresy interrogative summaries, and reconstructed intelligence files derived from partial transmissions originating from the Isstvan system. Unlike Administratum or Mechanicus records, which prioritize structure and function, Inquisition documentation is concerned with deviation, intent, and hidden variables. Within this framework, Rylanor is not initially treated as a primary subject of suspicion. He emerges instead as a point of analytical interest due to the consistency of his behavior in contrast to the collapse of the Emperor's children. Early Inquisition impressions classify him as a non-deviant element within a corrupted legion. This classification is not based on allegiance statements alone, but on pattern analysis. Pre-heresy records show no indicators of ideological drift, unauthorized behavioral shifts, or engagement in practices later associated with the traitor legions. This absence of deviation becomes more significant when examined against the broader dataset of Emperor's Children personnel, where gradual irregularities are detectable prior to the open betrayal. Rylanor's profile does not follow this trajectory. Observations derived from reconstructed Isstvan III intelligence further reinforce this classification. Fragmentary reports suggest that a Dreadnought matching Rylanor's designation engaged traitor forces after the initial virus bombardment. These reports are inconsistent in detail, but they converge on several key points. The subject demonstrated continued operational capacity despite environmental conditions designed to eliminate organic life. Engagement patterns indicate deliberate targeting of traitor-aligned units rather than indiscriminate action. There is no evidence of behavioral degradation or alignment shift during this phase. Inquisition analysts note that survival alone is not sufficient to establish loyalty. Several instances across the heresy document, individuals who initially resisted but later succumbed to corruption. What distinguishes Rylanor is the persistence of consistent behavior over an extended period under extreme conditions. This persistence reduces the probability of latent deviation and increases the likelihood of stable allegiance to pre-heresy doctrine. A recurring area of interest within Inquisition files involves his proximity to Fulgrim prior to the betrayal. As Ancient of Rites, Rylanor operated within a command-adjacent role, interacting with senior officers and participating in Legion-level processes. This proximity raises questions regarding exposure to early-stage corruption within the Emperor's Children. Inquisition records explore the possibility that he may have been aware of irregularities before they became explicit. However, there is no direct evidence confirming that he possessed actionable knowledge of the impending betrayal. Some speculative entries suggest that his reassignment approval for Saul Tarvitz may indicate partial awareness of internal inconsistencies. These entries are marked as unconfirmed. The reasoning is based on correlation rather than documented intent. Tarvitz expressed concern regarding Legion orders, and Rylanor approved his transfer shortly before the Isstvan deployment. While this sequence is notable, Inquisition standards require explicit evidence to establish causation. In the absence of such evidence, the event is classified as a potential indicator of perceptive judgment rather than confirmed foreknowledge. Further observations examine his operational state during prolonged isolation on Isstvan III. Several intercepted signal fragments, though degraded, reference a persistent combat presence consistent with a Dreadnought unit operating independently of supply lines. Inquisition analysts consider the possibility that Rylanor maintained functionality beyond standard operational limits. This raises questions regarding both mechanical sustainability and psychological endurance. Standard Dreadnought doctrine assumes periodic maintenance and recalibration. Extended isolation would typically result in system degradation and cognitive instability. The apparent contradiction between expected degradation and reported persistence is flagged as an anomaly. Some analysts propose that his prior stability, noted in Mechanicus records, may have extended into this phase, allowing him to maintain operational coherence longer than typical units. Others suggest that the data may be incomplete or misinterpreted, with multiple sources potentially conflating separate entities into a single continuous profile. This remains unresolved due to insufficient verifiable data. Conspiracy findings within Inquisition archives are cautious in tone but present several lines of inquiry. One hypothesis considers the possibility that Rylanor functioned as an unintended counterbalance within the Emperor's children. His consistent adherence to Legion doctrine, combined with his position of authority, may have limited the spread of early-stage deviation within certain operational areas. This hypothesis does not suggest intentional resistance prior to the heresy, but rather an indirect effect resulting from his role and behaviour. Another line of speculation addresses the nature of his resistance during the Isstvan engagement. Some records imply that his actions were not purely reactive, but exhibited elements of strategic intent. Engagement patterns suggest prioritization of targets that would disrupt traitor operations rather than maximize immediate damage output. This interpretation is based on limited telemetry, and is therefore classified as provisional. If accurate, it would indicate a level of operational planning under conditions where most units were reduced to survival-focused behaviour. A more speculative theory, marked as low confidence, considers the psychological impact of Dreadnought, interment on susceptibility to corruption. The separation of the interred individual from standard sensory input and social interaction may reduce exposure to certain forms of influence. In this context, Rylanor's mechanical state could have contributed to his resistance by limiting pathways through which corruption typically manifests. This theory is not supported by sufficient comparative data and is included primarily as a conceptual possibility. Inquisition records also address the symbolic implications of his actions. Within the broader narrative of the Horus Heresy, instances of loyalty within traitor legions are of particular interest. They provide insight into the limits of corruption and the conditions under which individuals resist systemic change. Rylanor is identified as one such instance. His profile is used in comparative analysis alongside other loyalist elements within traitor legions, contributing to a broader understanding of variance in allegiance outcomes. There is, however, a consistent effort within Inquisition documentation to avoid idealization. While his actions align with loyalty to the Imperium, records emphasize that he operated within a system that ultimately failed. His presence did not prevent the corruption of the Emperor's children, nor did it significantly alter the outcome of the Isstvan engagement. This perspective maintains analytical objectivity, focusing on observed behaviour rather than assigning disproportionate impact. In summary, Inquisition impressions of Rylanor are defined by contrast. He is observed as a stable element within an unstable legion, a consistent profile within a dataset marked by deviation. Observations confirm sustained operational effectiveness and alignment with pre-heresy doctrine, even under extreme conditions. Conspiracy findings explore the implications of his behaviour, considering possibilities of indirect influence, strategic resistance, and anomalous endurance, while acknowledging the limitations of available data. He is not classified as an outlier in the sense of unpredictability. but as an outlier in the persistence of expected parameters. Within Inquisition analysis, this makes him both a subject of interest and a reference point, a case through which broader patterns of loyalty, corruption, and resistance can be examined without distortion. Inquisition, interrogative records concerning Rylanor are inherently indirect. No verified instance exists in which the subject was physically apprehended, detained, or formally interrogated under controlled order conditions. As a result, all findings attributed to interrogation are derived from secondary sources. These include debriefings of surviving personnel, cross-examination of Traitor Legion captives, recovered Vox transmissions, and analysis of battlefield remnants associated with the Isstvan system. Within this framework, the Inquisition constructs a composite profile rather than a direct testimony. Primary interrogative inputs originate from individuals who encountered or believed they encountered a Dreadnought unit consistent with Rylanor's designation during or after the Isstvan III engagement. These testimonies are fragmented and vary in reliability, but they display notable convergence in specific areas. Witnesses describe a unit operating independently of established command structures, engaging traitor-aligned forces with deliberate targeting patterns. The subject is repeatedly described as non-responsive to external command signals, suggesting autonomous operational control rather than integration into any surviving chain of command. Interrogation of captured traitor elements provides additional, though less consistent, data. Some accounts reference a persistent Dreadnought presence that resisted eradication despite repeated engagement attempts. These descriptions often carry elements of exaggeration, likely influenced by psychological stress and retrospective bias. However, even when adjusted for distortion, they indicate that the subject maintained combat effectiveness beyond standard expectations. Inquisition analysts treat these accounts with caution but do not dismiss them entirely, as they align with other independent data fragments. One area of interrogative focus concerns communication attempts directed at the subject. Several records indicate that Vox transmissions were broadcast in an effort to establish contact, either for coordination or verification of allegiance. There is no confirmed instance of a sustained response. This absence is interpreted in multiple ways. It may indicate system degradation affecting communication capability. Alternatively, it may reflect deliberate non-engagement, with the subject prioritizing combat function over interaction. A third possibility considers partial reception without successful transmission, resulting in one-way awareness without reciprocal communication. Anomalies identified within these records are primarily associated with duration and consistency of activity. Standard Dreadnought operational doctrine assumes periodic withdrawal for maintenance, recalibration, and neural stabilization. The conditions on Isstvan III would have severely limited or eliminated access to such support. Despite this, multiple data points suggest continued operation over an extended time frame. This raises questions regarding both mechanical sustainability and cognitive integrity. Mechanically, prolonged operation without maintenance would typically result in degradation of actuator systems, reduced weapon efficiency, and eventual failure of core components. The absence of confirmed system collapse within the available data suggests either incomplete reporting or a typical resilience. Some Inquisition analysts propose that the subject may have engaged in minimal energy operational patterns between engagements, conserving power and reducing strain on critical systems. This theory remains speculative due to lack of direct telemetry. Cognitively, extended isolation within a Dreadnought presents significant challenges. The interred individual is deprived of normal sensory input and relies on artificial interfaces for perception. Over time, this can lead to disorientation, memory fragmentation, or altered behavioral patterns. The consistency observed in Rylanor's engagement behavior suggests that he retained functional cognitive stability. This is considered anomalous when compared to documented cases of long-term Dreadnought isolation, where deviations in behavior are more common. Personal encounter records, though limited, provide additional context. These encounters are primarily reconstructed from survivor testimonies and partial logs. In one recurring account, a Dreadnought matching Rylanor's profile is described as engaging traitor forces in proximity to damaged infrastructure, using terrain to limit exposure while maintaining lines of fire. The subject does not pursue retreating targets beyond a defined operational area, indicating controlled engagement boundaries rather than indiscriminate aggression. This behaviour aligns with earlier observations of disciplined targeting and resource management. Another set of encounter reports describes attempts by traitor units to neutralise the subject through concentrated fire and coordinated assault. Outcomes of these engagements are not uniformly documented, but the persistence of subsequent sightings suggests that initial attempts were unsuccessful. Inquisition analysts note that repeated engagement without confirmed elimination contributes to the subject's classification as a persistent threat within localized operational zones. There are also accounts marked as low confidence that describe brief instances of direct communication. These reports claim that the subject issued short, directive statements during combat, possibly identifying targets or issuing warnings. Due to the degraded nature of the sources and the lack of corroborating evidence, these claims are treated with caution. If accurate, they would indicate that at least partial communication capability was retained. However, the absence of consistent confirmation prevents definitive inclusion in the subject's profile. An additional anomaly involves the apparent lack of alignment shift over time. In many documented cases, prolonged exposure to extreme conditions combined with isolation and continuous combat results in behavioral drift. This can manifest as increased aggression, reduced discrimination in targeting, or deviation from original operational objectives. Rylanor's recorded behaviour does not exhibit these patterns. His engagement remains focused on traitor-aligned forces, with no indication of indiscriminate targeting or loss of operational clarity. Inquisition interrogative analysis also considers the possibility of external influence. Given the known presence of warp-related phenomena during the Horus Heresy, prolonged survival under such conditions raises questions regarding potential interaction with non-material forces. There is no direct evidence supporting this in Rylanor's case. No records indicate anomalous energy signatures, unexplained system modifications, or behavioural patterns consistent with warp corruption. This absence is noted, but not considered conclusive due to limitations in available data. From a procedural standpoint, the inability to directly interrogate the subject limits the scope of conclusions that can be drawn. The Inquisition relies on triangulation of indirect evidence, combining multiple low-confidence data points to identify consistent patterns. In Rylanor's case, these patterns converge on a profile characterized by sustained operational effectiveness, controlled engagement behavior, and absence of detectable deviation from original allegiance. In summary, interrogative findings present Rylanor as a subject defined by indirect observation rather than direct testimony. Anomalies are primarily associated with the duration of his activity and the stability of his behavior under conditions that typically produce degradation. Personal encounters, while fragmentary, consistently describe a controlled and deliberate combat presence. These elements combine to form a profile that resists simple classification, requiring continuous analysis within the broader context of Heresy-era anomalies. He remains, within Inquisition perspective, an unresolved case, not due to suspicion of corruption, but due to the persistence of variables that cannot be fully explained through standard operational models. Inquisition archival records concerning Rylanor transition in tone and structure as they move into sealed and partially redacted classifications. Unlike earlier analytical entries, which attempt to construct a coherent profile from fragmented data, these files reflect uncertainty that has not been resolved through subsequent investigation. Entire segments are removed or obscured, leaving only contextual framing, cross-references, and marginal conclusions. The absence of complete data becomes a defining characteristic of the subject's final classification. Recovered file headers indicate that multiple Ordos reviewed the same body of evidence over extended periods. Ordo Hereticus focuses on allegiance verification and the absence of doctrinal deviation. Ordo Malleus references are limited but present, primarily in relation to environmental conditions on Isstvan III and the potential for warp interaction during prolonged isolation. Ordo Xenos involvement is minimal and appears to be procedural rather than investigative, likely due to the subject's initial injury being attributed to Eldar engagement earlier in his service history. These overlapping jurisdictions suggest that Rylanor's case was not confined to a single line of inquiry, but instead intersected with multiple areas of concern within the Inquisition. Redacted segments frequently appear in connection with late-stage Isstvan records. These include partial transcripts of intercepted signals, references to unidentified energy readings, and annotations indicating attempted verification of long-duration operational activity. The removal of these sections prevents definitive interpretation. However, the surrounding text implies that investigators encountered data that could not be reconciled with standard models of Dreadnought sustainability. This does not confirm the presence of anomalous influence, but it indicates that the available explanations were insufficient to fully account for the observed patterns. One classified summary references the possibility of extended persistence beyond projected operational limits, followed by a redacted block and a concluding note stating that confirmation remains unattained. This phrasing is consistent with Inquisition documentation, where evidence is suggestive but not conclusive. It indicates that while multiple data points supported the hypothesis of prolonged activity, none met the threshold required for formal validation. As a result, the subject is neither confirmed nor dismissed as an anomaly, but remains in a state of unresolved classification. Additional redactions appear in files addressing potential contact events occurring after the initial phases of the Isstvan engagement. These entries include references to signal traces and localized disturbances that may correspond to continued activity. The lack of unredacted detail prevents identification of specific actions or interactions. Analysts note that the pattern of these entries suggests repeated attempts to verify the subject's status over time, rather than a single isolated investigation. This persistence implies that Rylanor's case continued to generate interest well beyond the immediate aftermath of the heresy. A subset of classified files explores the conceptual implications of the subject's profile. These documents do not assert new evidence, but instead examine what Rylanor represents within the broader context of Imperial doctrine. One recurring theme is the existence of stable loyalty within environments characterized by systemic corruption. The Emperor's Children as a legion underwent a rapid and comprehensive transformation during the heresy. The presence of individuals who did not follow this trajectory challenges assumptions regarding the inevitability of such shifts. Rylanor is cited as an example of resistance that is neither organized nor externally imposed, but intrinsic to the individual. Another theme addresses the limitations of predictive models used by the Inquisition. Prior to the heresy, deviations within legions were not consistently identified or interpreted as precursors to large-scale betrayal. Post-heresy analysis attempts to retroactively map these deviations and establish indicators for future detection. Rylanor's profile complicates this process. He does not exhibit the early warning signs associated with corruption, but his presence does not prevent the collapse of his legion. This suggests that stability at the individual level is not sufficient to counter systemic failure, and that predictive models must account for both individual and collective variables. There are also references, heavily redacted, to internal debate regarding the classification of Rylanor's final status. Some entries imply that he may have remained operational beyond the timeframe initially assumed by administratum records. Others suggest that the available data is insufficient to support such conclusions. The absence of a definitive resolution leads to the assignment of a conditional status, indicating that the subject's ultimate fate cannot be confirmed with available evidence. Inquisition conclusion summaries maintain a cautious and controlled tone. Rylanor is not elevated to the status of a central figure within heresy narratives, nor is he dismissed as a minor element. Instead, he is positioned as a case study. His documented behavior aligns consistently with loyalty to the Imperium and adherence to original Legion doctrine. His operational record demonstrates persistence under conditions that typically result in failure. His absence of deviation distinguishes him from the majority of his Legion. At the same time, the limitations of available data prevent full reconstruction of his actions during the final phases of his activity. Redacted files indicate that certain aspects of his case remain unresolved, either due to loss of information or classification restrictions. This incomplete picture reinforces the Inquisition's approach to his profile. He is not defined by a single verified narrative, but by a convergence of consistent patterns and unresolved variables. From an analytical perspective, Rylanor represents a fixed point within a period defined by instability. His actions do not alter the outcome of the Isstvan engagement or the broader trajectory of the Horus Heresy. However, they provide evidence that individual adherence to doctrine can persist even when institutional structures fail. This has implications for how the Inquisition evaluates both loyalty and corruption in future cases. The final classification assigned to Rylanor reflects this balance. He is recorded as a loyalist element within a traitor legion, with confirmed alignment to imperial doctrine and no evidence of corruption. His operational history is recognized as consistent and effective. His prolonged activity under adverse conditions is noted as unusual but not conclusively anomalous. His ultimate fate remains unconfirmed, with ongoing uncertainty preserved within classified records. In closing, the Inquisition does not present Rylanor as a mythologized figure or an exceptional anomaly beyond comprehension. He is treated as a subject whose documented behavior aligns with expected parameters in unexpected circumstances. The redacted nature of his final records ensures that his case remains open to interpretation, not as a matter of speculation, but as a reflection of incomplete data. He remains, within the archives, a resolved loyalty and an unresolved endpoint.